Hello, and welcome to one of a series of conversations that Children's Parliament is hosting as part of our Year of Childhood. And the conversations are about a number of the things that we are interested in when we speak with children about their human rights. So we talk about kindness and empathy and trust, idea of human dignity, and all these things underpin the experience of rights-based relationships. And when we have these conversations, children always talk with us about happiness. About being healthy, happy, and safe. It's a thing that they bring up, a thing that they seem to grasp intuitively, but we'll find out a wee bit more about that. And joining me today is Dr. Neil Finn from Edinburgh University. Welcome, Neil.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for taking part. So, Neil, as you know, we're an organisation interested in children's human rights and the idea, the experience of childhood. So would you mind just to start telling us a wee bit about your own childhood?
So I grew up in South Edinburgh. I was very lucky to have a very privileged childhood. I had three brothers, which I think helps to have siblings around you. I grew up in a beautiful city. Actually, I was also privileged in the sense that my mother had been a refugee in the war from Edinburgh, had been taken out to the countryside at West Linton, had lived in a little wooden hut with no electricity, no water, no running water, and this wooden hut in a field, and she had a romantic attachment to that place where she grew up with her three sisters. So she took us for my first few summers for several months there each summer. So I grew up also in the countryside as well as in Edinburgh. And my father then commuted from there into Edinburgh for work. So one aspect, I think, of my earliest memories that are probably most relevant to the pursuit of happiness or to the happy childhood is that the release that parents allow their children to run free. And I suppose partly my poor mum having to look after four boys in this tiny wooden hut. Her best strategy was just to sort of shove us out the door and let us run wild. And that, I think, was gold dust in terms of the adventurous, interesting, happy childhood where you learn lots of stuff that isn't in a sort of structured way. Sure. What else about childhood? Well, schools, I suppose, are very important for childhood, and I was in tough schools that were very, very strict in some ways. There were also, I suppose, one unhelpful thing for me was they were all boys' schools. So there were single-sex schools that was more common in those days, in the 60s. And coming from an all-boys family and being in an all-boys school, one disadvantage of that is that you end up thinking of the opposite sex as a kind of almost another species. So it was, although of course you met girls when you play out in the park and so on, most of my social engagements were with boys right the way through to the age of 18. And that, I think, is probably not an ideal childhood. The sex segregated childhood is not perfect in that regard. Right. But the schooling, I was an important place to make friends, to learn basic disciplines. There were some aspects also that weren't so good. So corporal punishment was absolutely rife still in the 60s and 70s in the schools I was at. Some pretty brutal physical punishments meted out. And I'm very, very glad we don't have that now. Other things that weren't ideal, I think, for example, an important thing that schools do for children is to facilitate competition. I don't think there's any harm in competition in childhood. But if competition is too channeled towards one or two outlets, then it's very restrictive. So in the schools I happened to go to, sport was extremely, as I said, they were boys' schools, and sport was extremely important. And the sports at the schools I happened to go to, rugby was absolutely paramount. And so if you weren't competitive at rugby, and I certainly wasn't at all built for that, it was pretty miserable. Your avenue for achieving competitive status was very restricted. So I think schools do need to think about allowing people to flourish in a big, wide variety of ways. There were other ways. I flourished in music and in running and arts and so on, drama, but they weren't foregrounded in the way that sport was. And I think nowadays the schools that I see nowadays are better at providing multiple avenues for children to flourish, to do well at their own thing and at multiple things.
Great, thank you. And what drew you to happiness as a kind of subject or a theme, if you like, in terms of your social anthropology? Why happiness?
So my route towards that is interesting. The earliest link was when I was working. I'd been volunteering in India with various sort of poverty reduction projects in the early 80s. And I wanted to do a PhD in anthropology, but I wanted to sort of withdraw and not make it all just about suffering. So I lived with forest people for 2 years, and these were among the objectively the poorest people in the whole world. Their infant mortality rate was absolutely appalling. They had very high rates of TB, which is a very debilitating disease. They had poor nutrition, very little education, and so on. But they had some things going for them, and they were brilliant at entertaining themselves, at having fun. They were incredibly creative and inventive in their religious festivals and so on. And so I learned some life skills during those 2 years that were absolutely wonderful for me, about the ability to get on with other people, to make entertainment out of just whatever's around you, and to cope with extreme suffering, but in dignified ways. So I also, after that, had a hankering for making happiness a more explicit topic in anthropology. But for the next 15 years or so, I was mainly working on human rights, which in the way that I was working was essentially mainly about human wrongs, actually, to be honest. I was working around lots and lots of different countries around the world promoting human rights, but it was mainly focused on things that go wrong with people's lives. Likewise, poverty reduction. It's a terribly important thing to do, but it was mainly focused on things that go wrong. So eventually I reached an age, early 40s, when I felt that most people around the world don't just aspire to have their rights respected, and they don't just aspire to escape from poverty, they actually aspire to live really well. They want to flourish, they want to enjoy their lives, they want to have loving relationships, they want to laugh, they want to have fun. And these things matter at least as much as the escape from poverty and the avoidance of brutality. So, and I realized suddenly that the disciplines that I worked in, particularly anthropology and international development studies, had remarkably little to say about happiness. It was kind of a taken for granted thing lurking in the background that you weren't really supposed to be explicitly interested in. So since then, for the last 15 to 20 years, I've spent most of my attention on learning about happiness from lots of different disciplines: philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and trying to put that all together to help people take an active interest, not just in their own happiness, but also in other people's happiness.
How do people respond when you say you study or you explore happiness? Do people understand?
So it's changed actually in the last 20 years. There's been a very rapid change in that. So around the turn of the century, when I was beginning to, if you like, come out as a happiness researcher, I would drop this, to close friends. I would trust them and say, look, I'm thinking of turning myself into a happiness scholar. And invariably people would laugh. It was funny then. And I would say, well, there are a couple of people. There's the bloke in the States, a psychologist who measures happiness, and there's a social psychologist in Amsterdam who runs the World Database of Happiness Studies. There are people who do it, so it's a thing. And so I want to do this for anthropology. So I became gradually more and more confident, and I've run the world's pretty much the only course on the anthropology of happiness for the last 16, 17 years now. But now happiness is a very explicit area of study. Some people call it well-being, and I think those two are very closely related. I don't much mind whether it's called well-being or happiness. But it's an area of study in just about all disciplines. So you have geographies of happiness, economics of happiness, happiness in education studies, architecture of happiness. People studying urban planning think about the happiness and well-being of citizens and how the layout of streets and buildings affects that, and so on. So it's become much more acceptable as a discipline.
Yeah. It's interesting you're saying that kind of connection with well-being, which is quite common language in terms of the work that we do in government policy. You know, people talk about children's well-being, and there's a framework for it and outcomes, and it can be measured and all that kind of thing. And it's a bit like the conversation we've had in this series around love.
Yes.
About whether people think something like love or something like happiness is a bit soft, it's a bit airy-fairy.
Yes.
They'd rather make it sound scientific by calling it well-being.
So love's
to me.
Yeah. So two things. I mean, love is quite close to happiness in that it's one of those words that makes your heart beat. You know, makes your heart beat faster, and you kind of know that it happens. But if you're a sort of stuffed shirt type and are worried about your professional dignity, you might avoid the term love or the term happiness because you think they're a bit squidgy and touchy-feely. Again, I don't think that's the case now in the way that it was 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, I was giving a talk on, you know, really grand sort of speech on what development is for at the World Bank in Washington. And a sea of people, basically mainly men in suits, white shirts and ties and posh suits. And they were expecting kind of hard-nosed talk about what social development is. And I said, the first thing I said was, it's mainly about love. And I thought that would be a kind of grenade in the room, and then they would all fall back and be amazed and shocked. And they actually weren't really. They were delighted that somebody was using that language in the World Bank because they knew it mattered, and they knew that we need to find ways of talking and promoting things that we ultimately value. So that then expanded into love and happiness, and then I became a happiness scholar. Regarding well-being, I've no objections to the term. In fact, I've just written a book on social well-being, but it's not a term, is it, that makes your heart thump? we don't sing songs about well-being. You'll be hard pressed if you go on iTunes. You won't find songs about well-being. You'll find hundreds of wonderful songs about happiness and love. Yeah. And that's because we care so deeply about those things.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think we've ever heard a child in the work we do talking about well-being, but they certainly talk about happiness.
Yes.
A lot. Yeah. So yeah, thinking a wee bit about childhood, what do you think happiness has got to do with a good childhood?
So happiness in childhood is a really interesting way of thinking. Thinking about happiness is really interesting to look at in relation to the life course. So around the world, it's very, very common when you first start conversations about happiness in different cultures for people to say, oh, well, happiness is something that happens in childhood, right? It's associated with being carefree and living for the moment and having cheerful, exciting activities and so on. So sometimes adults will say happiness really belongs in childhood. And in some cultures, they're even very stern about this and say, as an adult, you should be more grown up than that. You should have grown out of the need for happiness. You should just be getting on with practical affairs. So there's sometimes a contrast made between the carefree, happy childhood and the happy adulthood. I think now in the modern West and in many parts of the world, we're moving into a new phase where we recognize that the pursuit of happiness, including childlike carefree happiness, but also including perhaps more complex forms of happiness, like the pursuit of skills or the pursuit of interesting hobbies and so on. We're moving into an era when more and more of us think of happiness as something that we ought to pursue lifelong, and we should think about, and we should have conversations about, and that is a suitable thing for a grown-up to be interested in. And that's, I think, a good change.
Yeah. And so we have, in our national performance framework, all these very formal things, we have this national outcome that says that we should do all we can to ensure our children grow up in, an atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. But I'm also wondering, what can a country, what can a state do in terms of happiness, whether it's for children or for any citizen for that? Is it the business of the state?
So I think it's absolutely the business of the state to foster consideration of happiness, to get us talking about happiness. One of the things I'm often asked about happiness studies is, well, the thing that people most notice is that states around the world are measuring their citizens' happiness. And they simply present a survey question, say, taking your life as a whole on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 as your best possible life and 0 as your worst possible life, where are you? Yeah. So that measuring happiness has its uses, but and we now have, of course, a World Happiness Survey with results from most countries in the world, so we can look around the world and see how happy people think that they are in these different countries. And I think that's a useful step, but the far more important benefit beyond the results of those surveys is the fact that these surveys have got people talking about happiness. And that's why I say in all these different disciplines, if you're running a sports organization or an arts organization, you're not just talking about making the sport happen or putting the pictures on the wall of the gallery. You're actually talking nowadays about, so how do people feel when they take part in the activities that you facilitate? How does that play a part in the whole of their lives? Schools, likewise, when I first started looking at happiness in schools, there was absolutely almost zero research on the happiness of pupils. I mean, it was really extraordinary 20 years ago how little there was around the world. It was mainly about making schooling happen and getting the results, getting children into school and getting them to pass some exams. And that has changed really dramatically. And I think the state has played a role in that, not by forcing schools to measure happiness or forcing schools to judge themselves on how happy their pupils are. That would count as state interference in my book. But by just reminding educationalists and people in lots of different walks of life that what ultimately matters is not how fast the economy is growing or how little crime there is, but really how happy people live, how people think they are, and how much attention they pay to one another's happiness. And by the way, that's another thing I think is really worth bringing into this conversation is thinking and talking about happiness is not just about our own feelings and how well we think our lives are going. They can be almost entirely about other people. To think altruistically in a kindly way about other people's lives requires you to think about what makes them happy and what a good life would look like for them. And once you start thinking that way, you recognize that that your own happiness is really tied up in other people's happiness. They're not really separable things. So as a parent, your happiness consists in the happiness of your children, and vice versa. As a child, your happiness consists to a large extent in your parents' happiness. And beyond that, similarly, in a school, it's the happiness of the school, in the school climate, that either makes children happy or not. So social happiness is a really important consideration. And there, I think the state's main role is just to keep that in the conversation, not to legislate, not necessarily even to measure, just keeping it in our viewfinder.
So you mentioned schools. How can a school consider something like happiness? Is that about the social relationships that exist? Is it more than that, or?
So social relationships are in any walk of life the absolute paramount core of where our happiness comes from. We're the most social species. But a good school will consider happiness in lots of ways. I mean, one big division is happiness now versus happiness afterwards. So, for example, schools need to think about not just having a really cheerful school where all the children laugh and play all the time, because that might be no use for later life. So they do need to think about children's happiness later. So, and that's why, for example, excellence, the pursuit of excellence, and helping children learn to pay attention, sustained attention over a period of months to a topic, those things matter for later life. But at the same time, you're not going to achieve those long-term goals if your pupils are unhappy while at school. So your other goal is you want children to be happy in school, and you want their school happiness, their school-based happiness, to interact well with their home-based happiness. Yeah, so a school needs to think about how happy children are at home and whether they can do something to help that. And they also need to think about happiness in the school. And then they need to think about where that happens. Some of it's in the playground, some of it's in the sports halls, some of it's in the music halls, some of it's in the classroom, and in the way that they study. And at every detail. So a lesson plan, a good lesson plan, I believe, should think about pupils' emotional state during the lesson. Is there enough laughter in the lesson? Is there enough sustained interest on a topic, or are they being spoon-fed stuff without thinking about why they should be interested? Is there enough interaction? Is there enough opportunity to ask interesting questions? These things matter for the happiness here and now, but they also matter for the longer-term happiness that accrues from the habits, if you like, the habits of happiness that people can acquire during schooling.
So schooling, amongst everything else, has been kind of obviously impacted in the last year through the pandemic. And have you noticed, or however, either perceptions of happiness or pursuit of happiness, or how have these things been affected over the last year, do you think?
So clearly it's been a devastating year for children of all ages and in lots of ways. And I don't think we can get away from recognizing that. It's been wonderful how quick schools have responded with creative forms of teaching. And I think longer run, there's a likelihood that some of the forms of teaching that have happened during the lockdown periods, when children were excluded from school, separated from one another, some of the learning habits, some of the learning tools will be useful later on. But probably the biggest longer term benefit, we will recognize the importance of the social life of children and the social life in schools, having realized, fortunately, it looks as though we've only lost it for a year or so, or less than that. But we can now learn to cherish it, and constantly work on the value of the social life in schools. I'm hoping that longer run there'll be some benefits for schooling, and in my area, in university life too. For example, we've put our lectures online. We realized that online learning is nowhere near as good as actual face-to-face learning in groups or in classrooms. But one benefit might be that we shift towards much more passive learning, that we put, for example, short lectures online rather than standing up for an hour and giving a lecture. And we'll do more interactive learning in small groups, and over the longer term, that will make universities a happier place.
So we're coming towards the end of our time, and I suppose a question for us is about conceptualizing any of these things, kindness, love, any of these things as a right. Where do you kind of sit in that kind of thinking?
As I mentioned, I come from a rights background, and one of the conscious steps that I took when I switched towards happiness was a shift away from rights talk. Not that I think it's harmful in itself, it's just that I think that on its own, it tends to steer us towards looking at wrongs. It's one of the great paradoxes of the human rights movement. It's wonderful to declare, after the Second World War, that for the first time in humanity's existence, it may become possible in our lifetimes to facilitate basic human rights for all of humanity. So that's, beautifully aspirational. And for that reason alone, I think rights talk has a real value. But the trouble with rights talk is it tends to focus on ways in which rights are infringed, things that go horribly wrong with children's lives, nasty things that governments do to their citizens, and so on. And ultimately, I think it matters far more to recognize and learn from things that go right with people's lives. And so, to my mind, it's more important to talk about children's happiness and children's loving relationships and other things in children's lives, like being entertained, being interested, all these positive aspects of children's lives, we need to recognize those, recognize what goes right about them, and to celebrate that. That doesn't mean ignoring the problems when children's rights are infringed, but it means keeping rights talk in perspective and balancing it with talk about the positives in human lives.
Great. Thank you. Well, we'll certainly be continuing to talk about happiness with children wherever we are with them.
I love what you're doing, because I think that a balanced perspective on rights and happiness is the way to go, and I think that's really useful to get talking about both at the same time. Same as any other things that go wrong, whether you're talking about poverty or suffering or mental illness. Those conversations matter, but they are more valuable if they're linked with conversations about positive mental health, flourishing, happiness, and love.
Great. Thank you, Neil. That's been really fascinating. That's gone very quickly. Our time is up. I appreciate it, and we'll keep in touch with the rest of our series. But thank you.
I'll follow it with interest. Thank you very much for inviting me along.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.